What historical trends led to the rise of nationalism? Although many people may claim that historical trends played little value in the rise of nationalism, it was in fact historical trends that played a major impact and largely shaped nationalism. Now, what were these historical trends? They were changes in religion, changes in warfare and strategy, and changes in language. Let us start by looking at religion. Now, during this time period when nationalism was rising up, the biggest change to religion was obviously the Protestant Reformation. Now, to understand fully why it helped lead to the rise of nationalism, we must understand why it worked. Now, the reason the Protestant Reformation was so successful, especially when compared to earlier Reformation's attempt which completely failed, you must understand the concept of Baptists and bootleggers. The concept of Baptists and bootleggers is that for any change to happen, great or small, you must have two things. Baptists, those with a moral obligation for the change, and bootleggers, those with an economic or otherwise need motive for the change. So, for example, with the Protestant Reformation, we had people like Martin Luther, the Baptists, in this case, that wanted a change within the church. They wanted the end of the Pope and the Emperor ruling over the church. But others had wanted that as well. What did Martin Luther have that others didn't? The answer is supporters with an economic gain from supporting him. These were the bootleggers. Well, in this case, the princes. Now, the princes of this time period weren't particularly happy with the emperor or the pope ruling over them. But with merely economic purpose, they had no way of getting any sort of change. But with Martin Luther's new Protestant theology, they had a reason to oppose them on the Pope on supposedly moral grounds. And Martin Luther knew this. He was extremely careful to make sure that he got those princes on his side. He wrote a book called To the Christian Nobility, in which he directly tied the social and economic struggles of Germany at the time with following the Pope and having him at the head of the church. Following Martin Luther, many princes and other rulers plundered monasteries and cathedrals for money. After all, they should have had no role in the church. It was the rulers that were the heads. And with the fall of the unified church, with many schisms breaking out into Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, Baptists, and many other factions, the people of Europe had lost their shared sense of identity in religion. Before the Protestant Reformation, they were all Christians. That was what unified them. But after that, if they wanted a shared sense of identity, they would have to get it from somewhere else. But unfortunately, for them, the shared sense of identity with being gone from religion meant that they didn't exactly agree in religious matters. And because they didn't agree on religion, that led to war. Now, during the 1500s and 1600s, there was a lot of war. So let's look at a brief timeline of all these events. So in 1517, the Protestant Reformation began with Martin Luther. And it was a mere 5 years, in 1522, that the first outbreaks of violence broke out in the Peasants' Revolt in Germany. And many more fights were to come. Although there was a brief peace at Augsburg in 1555, it did not last, and by 1618, the 30 Years' War had broken out and would devastate much of Europe until the Peace of Westphalia was reached in 1648. But even beyond the 30 Years' War, there were many other smaller fights, such as the Wars of Religion in France, the English Civil War, and the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which, although not a war, there was much violence over religion. All in all, this was a major blow to much of Europe, but not just because of the loss of life. When you go on fighting for so much time, it costs a lot of money. And how does a country gain money? The answer is taxes. But the issue with just infinitely increasing taxes is that sooner or later, the people will just stop paying them. If you want to continue receiving tax money, you have to give the people something in return. And in many cases, that was freedoms. The people of the various countries were allowed more freedoms in exchange for higher taxes. And in exchange for these new freedoms led to a shared sense of identity. And a shared sense of identity would soon on lead to nationalism. But let us look at a more detailed example of this with Gustavus Adolphus. He was the king of Sweden from 1611 to 1632. He was a military commander during the 30 Years' War and highly successful at that. In fact, he was one of the main reasons that Sweden developed into a strong European country. But, like many other countries, he had to find a way to fund it. But he had a lot of land. What would he do with this land? Quote, to raise revenue, Gustavus Adolphus sold off or pawned crown land, end quote, from C.N. Truman. This meant that the people were gaining a lot of formerly royal property, and they were allowed to use it, and this was their freedom in exchange for having to pay for the war. So this meant that the long stretched out wars in Europe led to the rise of nationalism because of the freedoms that the people were given in exchange for the high taxes. But there is one more reason we must look at to understand the historical trends that led to the rise of nationalism, and that is of language. Now, before the Protestant Reformation or the invention of the printing press, Latin was the language in Europe. Although people might have spoken different languages in the certain towns and all, Latin was everywhere. From the law, governments, liturgies, business, everyone that had any sort of power almost certainly knew Latin. But then the printing press was invented, and the average person couldn't read or speak Latin. So rather than trying to teach thousands of people Latin, companies that were printing decided it would be easier just to print books and pamphlets in the language that the people spoke. This meant that in Germany, German books were being printed. In England, English books. France, French, and so on and so forth. This meant that Latin was a far less important factor, and instead it was the regional languages that were being used. But even still, the regional languages before 1517 widely varied. And why was this? It was because of dialects. Now, dialects had no universal factor to combine them. There was nothing that forced them to become one solidified, unified language until, once again, the printing press. Now, quote, print media particularly newspapers, was the foundation that allowed people to start seeing themselves as a unified nation. End quote. From Christopher Muscato. Why was this? Because with the printing press transforming, there was only one copy of the book printed in each language. There was no dialect for the one part of England and another for the other part. All of it was one dialect of English. And so that meant the people that did not natively speak that dialect either had to learn it or figure out how to or make a new copy of that book. And one of those options is clearly better. Now, the people had a shared sense of identity in that they all spoke the exact same language, and no regional dialects were involved. This meant that they had another source of the shared identity, which, as we have talked about, led to the rise of nationalism. So, in conclusion, the historical trends that led to the rise of nationalism were religion, warfare, and language. With religion shattering into many pieces, people no longer had a shared sense of identity from that. And with warfare and strategy, the people were granted new freedoms that developed into a shared sense of identity, along with the fact they were all speaking the same language. And with that, nationalism rose.